Shalom Yasharala. I've been blessed to find some information that I did in the 8th grade. And I thought I'd like to share it with you. It's questions for the test. Number 1, it says, what settled the quarrel over Missouri and Maine? Answer, Missouri Compromise. Number 2, who settled the dispute over whether the new lands were to be free or slave? Answer, David Wilmot. Number 3, his proposal was that no slavery shall ever exist in any part of the territory which might be secured from Mexico. This proposal was called blank. Wilmot Proviso. Proviso. Number 4, name a famous man of the North. Answer, Daniel Webster. This is Esau's curriculum. Number 5, name a famous man of the South. Answer, Jefferson Davis. All Edomites. Number 6, under the Compromise of 1850, California came into the Union as a blank state. Answer, California came into the Union as a free state. Number 7, what law required the people in the North to help catch runaway slaves? Answer, fugitive slave law. This 8th grade now. Number 8, who was the lady who Lincoln said started the Great War? Answer, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Number 9, what was the name of this book she wrote? Answer, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Number 10, in what way did the Northerns help runaway slaves escape to Canada? Answer, by means of the Underground Railroad. Number 11, what were the men who settled these slaves named? Answer, anti-slavery men or conductors. Number 12, in what act was the Missouri Compromise declared dead? Answer, Kansas/Nebraska Act. Answer, in a sentence or more, why Kansas fought a bloody war? Answer, because Northerners didn't want slavery in Kansas and Southerners did. Number 14, in what year was the Republican Party formed? Answer, 1854. Number 15, what party joined the Republicans? Answer, Free Soil Party. Number 16, why was the Missouri Compromise declared unconstitutional? Answer, because Dred Scott's case. Judge said he was not free. He was over slave line. Number 17, who was a famous man who tried to free the slaves by means of the Underground Railroad? Answer, John Brown. Number 18, what are the 7 states that succeeded? Answer, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Number 19, what were the Confederate States of America? Answer, 7 states that seceded. Number 20, who was Jefferson Davis and Alexander H. Stephens? Answer, Jefferson was president and Alexander vice president of the Confederate States. 21, in what month, day, and year did the Civil War begin? Answer, April 12, 1861. Number 22, what fact was the starting point of the war? Fort Sumter. Answer, Number 23. This fort was occupied by blank soldiers. Answer, Union soldiers. Number 24. Who was the president who said, I have no power to interfere? Buckingham. Number 25. What presented Lincoln with a difficult problem when he became president? Withdrawal of the southern states. They seceded. So this is on page 373 to 377. Number 1, succeed. Before Lincoln took over the presidency, southern states began to carry out their threat to withdraw or secede from the Union. First went South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. Number 2, the Confederate States of America. In February, 7 states which had succeeded sent representatives to Montgomery, Alabama to form a new government. These men drew up a constitution for a new nation, which was to be called the Confederate States of America. The Constitution was like that of the United States. It provided that the Congress of the Confederation could not interfere with slavery. Number 3, Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was elected president of the Confederate States, and Alexander H. Stephens of Georgia was chosen vice president. Number 4, April 12, 1861, war, Civil War. From all around the harbor, Confederate cannon began to fire at Fort Sumter. Peace and quiet no longer reigned in Charleston Harbor. Now everywhere in the United States, war has begun. Number 5, Fort Sumter. It was on an island. It was occupied by soldiers of the United States Army. Lincoln was willing to do something about the states that were seceding, while Buckingham took no steps to stop the seceding states. He said, I have no power to interfere. States started seceding, sent representatives to Montgomery, Alabama, to form a new government called the Confederate States of America. The harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, was broad and quiet. Warm in the spring sun, the city lay at the western end of the harbor. To the east, toward the sea, 2 long fingers of land curved close together to form the entrance to the harbor. Midway between the tips of these fingers of land was a tiny island, and on this island was Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was occupied by soldiers of the United States Army. The Confederate leaders demanded that these soldiers leave the fort, just as other United States soldiers had previously turned over other forts to the Confederacy. But the commander of the fort would not agree. When the Confederate leaders learned that Lincoln had ordered ships to take food and other supplies to Sumter, they feared that reinforcements might also be landed. The days and nights seemed to grow longer. People were tense with excitement. At 4:30 in the morning, on April 12, 1861, war began. The first state to be found out the Louisiana territory was Louisiana. Louisiana wanted slavery, entered Union as a slave state. But in 1819, when Missouri asked to be admitted to the Union, an alarming dispute broke out between the North and the South. Owners of slaves settled in Missouri. When Missouri asked permission to become a state, its people adopted a rule that would allow slavery in the new state. But when Missouri's request to enter the Union came before Congress, a representative from New York demanded that Congress admit only if Missouri would rid itself of slavery. This angered the South. Southerners feared that if slavery were forbidden in other states to be carved out of the Louisiana Purchase, why ask the South? Should northern men without slaves be allowed to go west to settle and form states when southern men with slaves were forbidden to do so? Missouri Compromise settles the quarrel. The Missouri Compromise settles the quarrel. When the dispute was at its highest pitch, a fortunate thing occurred. Maine, which was then part of Massachusetts, asked to be admitted as a separate state. The people of Maine did not need or want slavery. At once, people began to say, here is a chance to settle the bitter quarrel over Missouri. The settlement made in 1820 is called the Missouri Compromise, or the Compromise of 1820. Under the compromise, Missouri came into the Union as a slave state and Maine as a free state. It was also agreed that a line, which was a continuation of the southern boundary of Missouri, should be drawn westward across the entire Louisiana Purchase. In the future, all states to be made out of the Louisiana Purchase were to be free states if they lay north of that line. They drew that line and said they lay north of that line, they would be free states. If they lay south of the line, they would be permitted to have slavery. This compromise seemed fair. The South received what it had asked, slavery in Missouri. The North received the votes of Maine in Congress to balance those of Missouri. Both sides were relieved that Congress had passed a law settling the question of slavery in the territory of the Louisiana Purchase. The North was especially pleased, for Congress had put itself on record as having the right to say what should be done about slavery in new territories still to be made into states. As soon as the Mexican War began, it became clear that the United States would win immersed new territories. At once there arose the question, are the new lands to be slave or free? Hardly had the war begun in 1846 when a representative from Pennsylvania named David Wilmot suggested an answer to the question. He proposed in Congress that it be plainly and definitely understood that no slavery shall ever exist in any part of any territory which might be secured from Mexico. This proposal was called the Wilmot Proviso, Proviso. The discovery of gold caused many people to rush to California gold rush. These people formed a government of their own and asked to be admitted as a state, a free state. To Southerners, this was an outrage. They insisted that this land should not be closed to slavery. Northerners insisted that it should be. If slavery in California was to be discussed in Congress, slavery in the rest of the new territories would need to be discussed. 2. The question was dangerous. If another compromise could be made, the country might split in two. The Southerners were losing rapidly in the House. Suppose the president were also to be from the North. If the North gets control of the territories, And if the new states entering the Union are all free states, then we shall be outnumbered in the Senate too. There was Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, great orator and statesman, who wanted more than anything else to keep the country united. There was Henry Clay of Kentucky, known as the Great Compromiser. Clay also wanted to keep the country together and was skillful at finding ways of keeping peace when men disagreed. And there was John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, champion of states' rights. Although he was now old and sick, he was determined that South Carolina and slavery should have their say. He opposed the compromise. One of the famous young men was Stephen A. Douglas, the Little Giant from Illinois. Believed the people should settle questions like slavery for themselves. Another, William H. Seward of New York, said that God's law made men free and that God's law was a higher law than the Constitution of the United States. Brilliant young man also spoke for the South. Among them were Jefferson Davis of Mississippi and Alexander A. Stephens of Georgia. When the South later formed its own government, these two men became its president and vice president. Compromise of 1850. Number one, California was admitted into the Union as a free state. Number two, the rest of the territory obtained from Mexico was divided into the New Mexico territory of Utah Territory and Utah Territory. When their territories were ready to become states of the Union, the people there were to decide for themselves whether slavery should be permitted. Slaves were not to be brought or sold in the District of Columbia. To make it harder for slaves to win their freedom by escaping from slave states to free states, a fugitive slave law was passed. This law required people in the free states to help catch escaped slaves. Congress hoped by this compromise to settle the slavery question forever. The members wanted no more angry debates which might prove dangerous to the nation. Americans sighed in relief. Surely, thought many of them, slavery could now be forgotten. In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. His description of the suffering of slaves and the cruelties of their masters was hardly a fair picture of conditions in the South. But his dramatic story wrung the hearts of hundreds of thousands of Northerners who read it and caused them to oppose slavery. So great was the influence of the book in the North that Abraham Lincoln, in later years, is said to have quoted Mrs. Stowe as the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war. In the South, however, Uncle Tom's Cabin aroused a storm of protest and increased the bitter feelings against the abolitionists. In spite of the fugitive slave law, Northerners continued to help runaway slaves by means of the Underground Railroad. This was really not a railroad at all, but a way of helping runaway slaves to reach places where they would be safe. The slaves who reached the North were sheltered by anti-slavery men. These men, called conductors, took the slaves by night from one house to another. each house farther north than the last. Finally, the slaves reached Canada and freedom. Although not many slaves escaped in this way, the Underground Railroad further inflamed feelings between the North and the South. Kansas-Nebraska Act was a law which will set up two new governments, one in Kansas Territory and one in Nebraska Territory. If this law is passed, the people of these territories may decide for themselves whether slavery shall be permitted there. A northern senator is making a speech using strong words. Bleeding Kansas fights over slavery, 1854 to 1857. Men started moving to Kansas. Almost all men who went there carried guns. Some are from the north, some from the south. They say to others, Kansas is now open to either freedom or slavery. The men of the South say, we will take our slaves to Kansas. We will fight to keep them if we have to. The men of the North say, we will allow no slaves in Kansas. We will fight to keep them out if we have to. The Republican Party, 1854. We see a group of men holding a meeting under the tree. The old political parties will not do. One of them is saying, the other men cheer. We cannot vote for the old parties, the Whigs and the Democrats, any longer. The great question is, shall there be slavery or freedom in the new territories? The old parties seek to sidestep this question. The Congress has passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which says that the people can decide whether or not to have slavery. For our part, let us speak out loud and clear. It is both the right and the duty of Congress to forbid slavery in the territories. We are strong, and we shall become stronger in the election of 48. The so-called Free Soil Party won 10% of the vote on their platform. Free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. The Free Soilers will join us. Let's form a new party. Let's call ourselves Republicans. Missouri Compromise is declared unconstitutional in the Dred Scott case, 1857. The Supreme Court was considering the case of a Negro, Dred Scott by name. Scott had been a slave in the South, but he had been taken to the territory north of the Missouri Compromise line. Missouri Compromise had declared that in the territory there could be no slavery and no slaves. Therefore, Dred Scott claimed to be a free man. He asked the Supreme Court to compel his master to free him. Judge read what court decided. Dred Scott is not free. Slaves are property and do not have the rights of citizens. The Constitution protects property in the territories as well as in the states. Congress, says the judge, had no right to forbid slavery in the territories. Therefore, the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. In the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Congress had declared the Missouri Compromise dead, but had suggested that the voters in a territory could decide the question of slavery for themselves. John Brown had planned to free the slaves. After seizing United States Armory at Harper's Ferry in order to get arms, he had cried to the slaves, "We are here to set you free. Seize arms and defend your freedom." But not one slave followed him. John Brown captured, is tried for treason, and hanged. Douglas for Missouri Compromise, Lincoln for Wilmot Proviso. Douglas for Kansas Nebraska Act, Lincoln for Dred Scott. Douglas for slavery in the states where it already existed. That's all I have. It tells you concerning Lincoln. So Lincoln was Abraham Lincoln from 1809 to 1865. So he was born in Kentucky, moved to Springfield, Illinois. He became a lawyer. He was a Republican. That was it. So I thought that was pretty interesting to still have from what date is on here? The third month, the 22nd day in the 1966. So it's good information, you know, as far as dealing with how they still was looking at us as a commodity as we are today. And we were not citizens then, we're not citizens now, brothers and sisters. Shalom.